The year is 1200 BCE, and something remarkable is happening in the forested valleys of Central Europe. While Mediterranean civilizations are collapsing around them, a new culture is quietly emerging that will reshape the continent for millennia. This isn't a story about sudden invasion or dramatic conquest. It's about iron, salt, and the slow transformation of Bronze Age communities into something the ancient world had never seen before. If you enjoy sleep stories like this, like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The Hallstatt period marks the true beginning of Celtic civilization, though the people living through it wouldn't have recognized that name. Around 800 BCE, in what's now Austria, communities near a lakeside village were mastering techniques that would give them an unprecedented advantage. They discovered how to work iron, a metal that would democratize power in ways bronze never could. Copper and tin, the ingredients for bronze, came from scattered sources across Europe and required extensive trade networks to obtain. Iron ore, by contrast, was everywhere. Any community with the right knowledge could now equip armies, clear forests, and reshape their landscape without depending on distant suppliers. The Hallstatt settlement itself tells us exactly how transformative this shift was. The salt mines that gave the site its economic foundation have preserved organic materials in ways that rarely survive elsewhere. Leather garments still intact after 3,000 years. Wooden tools showing sophisticated carpentry techniques. Even human remains complete enough to reveal details about daily life that usually vanish into dust. These weren't primitive people scratching out survival in the wilderness. They were craftsmen, traders, and artists who'd built a complex society around a single valuable resource. The cemetery at Hallstatt contained over 2,000 graves, and what archaeologists found in them reveals a society already stratified by wealth and power. Some graves held simple pottery vessels and basic tools. Others contained elaborate bronze and iron weapons, decorated with intricate geometric patterns, gold jewelry, and imported goods from Mediterranean civilizations hundreds of kilometers away. The warrior elite who controlled this society proclaimed their status through material culture that combined deadly functionality with stunning artistic achievement. Those long iron swords they forged weren't just weapons, they were statements. The distinctive anthropomorphic hilts featured stylized human faces that seemed to watch anyone who approached their owner. The craftsmanship required to create these weapons took years to master, and only the most skilled smiths could produce blades that were both flexible enough to absorb impacts and hard enough to hold an edge through extended combat. These swords would become symbols of Celtic warrior culture, instantly recognizable across Europe for the next 1,000 years. The people creating this culture weren't unified under any central authority. They were a collection of related tribes, sharing similar languages, religious practices, and material culture. Linguistic evidence suggests the Celtic language family was already differentiating during this period, with the ancestors of what would become Gaulish, Brittonic, and Gaelic languages beginning their separate evolutionary paths. These linguistic developments paralleled the geographic spread of Celtic-speaking peoples across an increasingly vast territory. Trade networks during the Hallstatt period extended far beyond the Celtic heartland, connecting these communities to the developing urban civilizations of the Mediterranean. Greek pottery appears in elite burials throughout the region, evidence of extensive commercial contacts with the south. The Vix burial in Burgundy, dating to around 500 BCE, contained a massive bronze crater of Greek manufacture, demonstrating both the wealth of Celtic elites and their international connections. This wasn't passive importation of foreign goods. Celtic craftsmen were adapting techniques and styles from Mediterranean sources to their own aesthetic traditions, creating hybrid forms that would influence European art for centuries. Starting around 700 BCE, Celtic-speaking peoples began moving westward into what is now France, establishing settlements that would become the foundation of Gallic civilization. These migrations weren't sudden invasions, but gradual movements of families and clans seeking new agricultural land and trading opportunities. The migrants brought with them their distinctive material culture, religious practices, and social organization, gradually transforming the cultural landscape of Western Europe without necessarily displacing existing populations. The establishment of Latin culture around 450 BCE marked a new phase in Celtic development. Named after the Swiss lakeside site where distinctive artifacts were first discovered, Latin culture represented a flowering of Celtic artistic achievement that surpassed even the sophisticated work of the Hallstatt period. The Latin style is immediately recognizable: flowing curvilinear designs, stylized animal motifs, and complex interlacing patterns that seem to shift and move as light plays across metal surfaces. Latin metalworkers developed techniques that surpass their Hallstatt predecessors in both technical skill and artistic vision. Their bronze work featured intricate repoussé decorations created by hammering designs into metal from the reverse side. Their iron weapons combined deadly efficiency with stunning beauty in ways that purely functional tools never achieve. The Battersea shield, though dating to the later Latin period, exemplifies the artistic heights these craftsmen reached. Its bronze surface bears elaborate spiral patterns and stylized faces that seem to shift and change depending on viewing angle and lighting conditions. Pottery traditions evolved alongside metalwork during this period. Early Hallstatt ceramics had featured simple geometric decorations and functional forms, but Latin potters developed more sophisticated techniques and decorative schemes. They began producing wheel-thrown vessels with complex painted designs, often incorporating the same curvilinear motifs found in metalwork. The pottery from sites like Manching in Bavaria shows clear evidence of specialized production, with certain workshops focusing on particular vessel types or decorative styles. Settlement patterns reveal a society transitioning from scattered farmsteads to more complex urban centers. The Hallstatt period saw the emergence of hill forts, fortified settlements positioned on elevated terrain for defensive advantage. These sites, known as oppida in later periods, served as regional centers for trade, craft production, and political authority. The Heunerberg, a massive hill fort in southwestern Germany, exemplifies this development. Its mud brick fortifications, built using Mediterranean techniques, enclosed an area of several hectares containing workshops, storage facilities, and elite residences. The agricultural foundations of early Gallic society were surprisingly sophisticated. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Celtic world reveals the use of iron plowshares, which enabled more efficient cultivation of heavy soils. The Gauls practiced crop rotation, maintained extensive livestock herds, and developed techniques for food preservation that supported larger populations. Their agricultural surplus enabled craft specialization and supported the warrior elites who would later become famous for their military prowess. Social organization among the early Gauls was hierarchical, but not rigidly stratified. At the apex stood warrior aristocrats who controlled land, livestock, and trade relationships. These elites were buried with elaborate grave goods, including weapons, jewelry, and imported luxury items that proclaimed their status and wealth. Below them were free farmers, craftsmen, and traders who formed the backbone of Celtic society. At the bottom were slaves, often prisoners of war or debtors, who performed agricultural labor and domestic service. Religious practices centered on natural features like springs, groves, and hilltops, which were considered sacred spaces where the divine world intersected with human experience. Votive offerings of weapons, jewelry, and other valuable items were deposited in rivers and lakes, creating underwater treasure troves that have provided archaeologists with invaluable insights into Celtic religious beliefs. The famous Gundestrup cauldron, though dating to the later Latin period, illustrates the complexity of Celtic religious imagery, with its depictions of gods, goddesses, and ritual scenes. The Druids, the priestly class that would later fascinate Roman observers, likely emerged during this early period as specialists in religious ritual, legal procedures, and oral tradition. Though direct evidence for Druidism in the Hallstatt period is limited, the complex religious symbolism found in elite burials suggests the existence of a sophisticated priesthood responsible for maintaining religious knowledge and conducting important ceremonies. Warfare during the early Celtic period was both practical necessity and cultural institution. The warrior ethos that would later characterize Gallic society was already evident in Hallstatt burials, where men were interred with spears, swords, and shields that proclaimed their martial status. These weapons weren't merely ceremonial. Analysis of skeletal remains reveals evidence of violent deaths and healed battle wounds that testify to the reality of intertribal conflict. The early Gauls developed distinctive military technologies that would influence European warfare for centuries. Their long iron swords, designed for slashing rather than thrusting, required new fighting techniques and tactical formations. Celtic shields, typically oval or rectangular and constructed of wood covered with leather and metal fittings, provided protection while allowing for aggressive offensive action. The famous carnix, a bronze war trumpet shaped like a boar's head, produced haunting sounds that could be heard over the din of battle, coordinating attacks and demoralizing enemies. By 500 BCE, the Celtic peoples of Gaul had developed a complex society that would endure for centuries. This wasn't yet the mature civilization that would later confront Rome, but the foundations were firmly established. The technological innovations, artistic traditions, social hierarchies, and religious practices that characterized this formative period would persist and evolve, creating one of ancient Europe's most influential cultures. The transformation from Bronze Age communities to Iron Age sophistication had taken centuries, but the result was unmistakable. The Gauls had arrived on the historical stage, and they would reshape it in ways no one could have predicted. The sophisticated material culture that characterized mature Gallic civilization emerged from centuries of gradual refinement in metallurgical techniques, artistic expression, and social organization. These weren't primitive tribal societies stumbling toward complexity. By the 4th century BCE, Gallic craftsmen had achieved mastery over their materials that rivaled anything produced in the Mediterranean world, creating objects that combined functional excellence with aesthetic sophistication that still impresses modern observers. The oppida represented the most visible expression of this cultural maturity. These weren't simple hill forts thrown up for temporary defense. They were permanent urban centers that served as focal points for economic, political, and religious life across vast territories. Take Bibracte, the Aedui capital, sprawling across 135 hectares of elevated terrain. The site contained specialized quarters for different economic activities, residential districts organized by social status, and public spaces designed for civic functions that paralleled those of contemporary Greek and Roman cities. The fortifications that protected these centers demonstrated engineering sophistication that challenges simplistic narratives about Celtic technological backwardness. The Murus Gallicus construction technique combined stone facing with internal timber frameworks reinforced by iron nails, creating walls that could absorb the impact of siege engines while resisting fire and scaling attempts. This wasn't borrowed Mediterranean technology. It represented an indigenous innovation that solved defensive problems in ways uniquely suited to Gallic conditions and available materials. Inside these walls, economic specialization reached levels that required sophisticated systems of resource distribution and social coordination. Metallurgical workshops produced weapons, tools, and decorative objects using techniques that demanded years of training to master. Pottery production moved beyond household crafts to become industrial-scale operations, supplying regional and international markets. Textile manufacturing transformed raw wool and flax into finished fabrics through processes involving multiple specialized workers each contributing specific skills to the final product. This economic complexity rested on agricultural foundations that were anything but primitive. Gallic farmers had developed crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility while maximizing yields. Their use of heavy ploughs enabled cultivation of clay soils that lighter Mediterranean implements couldn't effectively work. Livestock breeding programs produced animals superior to their Mediterranean counterparts in size and adaptability to northern European conditions. These weren't accidental developments. They reflected conscious experimentation and the systematic application of agricultural knowledge accumulated over generations. Trade networks connected Gallic producers to markets extending from Britain to the Black Sea. Professional merchants maintained permanent trading posts in distant territories, facilitating exchanges that brought exotic goods to Gallic communities while distributing Gallic products throughout the ancient world. Amber from the Baltic appeared in Gallic jewellery. Mediterranean wine arrived in distinctive amphorae that were recycled for storage. British tin combined with continental copper to produce bronze alloys used in both utilitarian and ceremonial contexts. The development of coinage revolutionized these commercial relationships. Early Gallic coins drew inspiration from Greek and Roman prototypes, but they quickly evolved distinctive characteristics, reflecting local artistic traditions and political structures. The complex iconography found on these coins provides valuable insights into Gallic mythology and political organization that written sources don't preserve. These weren't crude imitations of Mediterranean money. They represented sophisticated adaptations that served Gallic needs while expressing Gallic aesthetic sensibilities. The artistic achievements that characterized this period reached their zenith in metalwork that combined technical virtuosity with profound symbolic meaning. The Latin style that emerged during the 5th century BCE created a distinctive aesthetic, emphasizing flowing lines, stylized natural forms, and complex interlacing patterns. This wasn't merely decorative art. It carried deep cultural significance that reinforced social hierarchies and expressed religious beliefs in ways that transcended simple ornamentation. Consider the Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in Denmark, but clearly of Gallic manufacture. This massive silver vessel displays repoussé panels depicting gods, goddesses, and ritual scenes that required extraordinary technical skill to create. The imagery references Druidic practices, Celtic mythology, and social customs that illuminate aspects of Gallic culture that written sources barely mention. Each panel tells stories that would have been immediately recognizable to contemporary viewers, but require careful analysis for modern scholars to interpret. Personal ornamentation proclaimed social status and cultural identity through objects that demanded years of training to produce. Torques, the distinctive neck rings that became symbols of Celtic identity, were crafted from gold, silver, and bronze, using techniques requiring mastery of multiple metallurgical processes. The Great Torque from Snettisham exemplifies this craftsmanship with its twisted gold wires and elaborate terminals, featuring stylized faces and geometric patterns that demonstrate the heights of technical achievement possible within Gallic artistic traditions. Religious practices provided the framework within which these artistic and economic activities occurred. Natural features like springs, groves, and hilltops were considered sacred spaces where divine and human worlds intersected. Votive offerings deposited in rivers and lakes created underwater repositories that archaeologists continue to explore. These weren't random deposits. They followed precise protocols maintained by Druids who understood the theological significance of specific locations and appropriate offerings for different purposes. The Druids themselves represented a phenomenon unique to Celtic civilization. These weren't simple priests performing rote rituals. They were intellectual specialists who spent decades mastering vast bodies of oral knowledge encompassing law, history, astronomy, and theology. Their authority transcended individual tribal boundaries. creating pan-Gallic networks of shared knowledge and cultural practices that bound otherwise fragmented political entities together through common intellectual traditions. Human sacrifice, which so horrified Roman observers, played a significant role in this religious system. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ribemont-sur-Ancre reveals that captured enemies were sometimes ritually killed and their bodies displayed as offerings. These weren't acts of barbaric cruelty, they were carefully orchestrated ceremonies designed to secure divine favor through the most valuable offering possible, human life itself. The theological reasoning behind these practices reflected sophisticated understanding of reciprocal relationships between gods and mortals that required appropriate compensation for divine intervention. Ritual deposits in bodies of water represent another crucial aspect of Gallic religious practice. The Llyn Cerrig Bach hoard from Wales illustrates this tradition with its collection of weapons, tools, and decorative items deliberately deposited over several centuries. These underwater sanctuaries served multiple functions simultaneously: repositories for communal wealth, symbols of tribal identity, and points of contact with aquatic deities who governed the mysterious forces associated with water. The political structures that governed this complex society had evolved far beyond simple chieftainships by the 4th century BCE. Major tribal confederations commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of people across vast territories. These weren't loosely organized alliances that dissolved after specific military campaigns. They were sophisticated political entities with administrative systems capable of governing large populations, coordinating military operations, and managing economic resources on unprecedented scales. The Aedui exemplify this political evolution. Their confederation controlled territories extending from the Loire Valley to the Saône River, encompassing approximately 15,000 square kilometers of fertile agricultural land. Their political organization had transitioned from traditional monarchy to oligarchic systems where wealthy nobles competed for annual magistracies, carrying both prestige and practical authority. The position of vergobre, limited to a single year and restricted to prevent family monopolization, represented sophisticated understanding of how to distribute power while preventing dangerous concentrations. Tribal assemblies evolved from informal warrior gatherings into legislative bodies capable of debating complex policy issues and making binding decisions affecting entire confederations. These assemblies developed procedural rules governing debate, voting, and implementation that created institutional frameworks functioning effectively, even during political crises. They also served as forums for resolving disputes between different social classes and territorial communities, providing mechanisms for conflict resolution that prevented many potential internal conflicts. Military organization reflected this political sophistication through systems that combined traditional warrior culture with tactical innovations learned from Mediterranean contacts. Celtic warriors weren't undisciplined berserkers charging blindly into battle. They were trained fighters organized into coordinated units capable of executing complex maneuvers. Their long iron swords required specific fighting techniques that maximized slashing effectiveness. Their shields, constructed of wood covered with leather and metal fittings, provided protection while allowing aggressive offensive action. The Carnics' war trumpets produced sounds that could be heard across battlefields, coordinating attacks and demoralizing enemies through their haunting tones. The warrior aristocracy that dominated military affairs maintained private armies bound through personal relationships, formalized by elaborate oath-taking ceremonies. These bonds created fighting units motivated by loyalty stronger than mere tribal identity. Warriors who swore fealty to noble lords received protection, legal support, and shares of plunder from successful raids. In return, they pledged absolute loyalty, including willingness to die defending their lord's honor. These relationships formed the backbone of Gallic military effectiveness, creating small but highly motivated forces capable of sustained campaigns. This was the civilization that would soon face its greatest challenge: the sophisticated political structures, economic systems, and cultural achievements that had developed over centuries would be tested against an expanding Mediterranean power whose military efficiency and administrative capabilities would ultimately transform the Celtic world forever. But before that confrontation, Gallic society had reached a level of complexity and sophistication that deserves recognition on its own terms, not merely as a prelude to Roman conquest. The material evidence that archaeologists continue to uncover reveals societies far more advanced than simple narratives about Celtic barbarism suggest. The Oppida weren't primitive villages. They were urban centres with populations in the tens of thousands. The economic systems weren't basic subsistence operations. They were complex networks involving specialised production, long-distance trade, and sophisticated financial instruments. The artistic traditions weren't crude folk crafts. They were sophisticated aesthetic systems requiring years of training to master and expressing profound cultural meanings through their forms and symbols. The transition from those scattered proto-Celtic communities to what we'd recognise as mature Gallic civilization required another crucial element beyond political sophistication. The economic networks that bound these tribes together created wealth on a scale that would have been impossible in earlier periods. Consider what happened when you combined the agricultural surplus from those fertile valleys with the mineral resources of the uplands. Iron from the Jura, gold from the Rhine tributaries, tin from Britain, salt from Hallstatt-style deposits throughout the region. These weren't just trade goods. They were the foundation of an economic system that could support professional craftsmen, full-time warriors, and a priestly class that didn't need to work the fields. The mining operations alone required organizational capabilities that rivaled anything the Mediterranean world could offer. At sites like Bibracte, archaeologists have found evidence of systematic iron production involving hundreds of workers. The furnaces operated continuously during production seasons, consuming vast quantities of charcoal that required coordinated forestry management across tribal territories. The finished iron went everywhere. Agricultural tools that enabled expansion into heavier soils, weapons that equipped the warrior bands, trade goods that connected Gallic communities to networks stretching from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. But here's where things get interesting. The Gauls didn't just extract and export raw materials. They developed manufacturing industries that added value through skilled craftsmanship. The blacksmiths working in Gallic Oppida weren't producing crude functional objects. They created weapons with pattern-welded blades that combined multiple types of iron and steel, producing swords that were simultaneously flexible and hard. The bronze workers mastered lost wax casting techniques that allowed them to produce objects of extraordinary complexity. The potters operated large-scale workshops with multiple kilns, standardized forms, and distribution networks that reached customers hundreds of kilometers away. The economic scale becomes apparent when you examine the coinage systems that emerged during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. The earliest Gallic coins were crude imitations of Greek and Roman prototypes. Within a few generations, they'd evolved into distinctly Celtic artistic expressions while maintaining their function as standardized units of exchange. The gold staters of the Parisii tribe featured highly stylized horses that bore little resemblance to actual animals, but conveyed movement and energy through abstract forms. The rainbow cups of southern Germany, so named because treasure hunters claimed they appeared where rainbows touched the ground, represented a uniquely Celtic approach to monetary art. These coins weren't just pretty objects. They facilitated commercial transactions across tribal boundaries, enabling merchants to conduct business without the cumbersome barter systems that characterized earlier periods. A merchant from the Aedui could travel to Sequani territory and purchase goods with coins that would be accepted at face value, then use those same coins in transactions with the Helvetii. This monetary integration created economic efficiency that accelerated the development of specialized production and long-distance trade. The physical infrastructure supporting this economic system would have impressed Roman observers if they'd bothered to look closely before the conquest. The Gauls had developed an extensive network of roads connecting major settlements, constructed using local materials and engineering techniques adapted to diverse terrain. These weren't paved Roman roads. but they were maintained thoroughfares that could handle wheeled traffic throughout most of the year. The bridges spanning major rivers used wooden construction that could be quickly repaired after flooding while supporting heavy loads. The harbour facilities at coastal Oppida incorporated breakwaters, docking areas, and storage buildings that facilitated maritime commerce. The trading posts that Gallic merchants established in distant territories created permanent commercial relationships that transcended temporary political alliances. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Rhine and Danube reveals Gallic merchants living in mixed communities alongside Germanic and Mediterranean traders. These commercial enclaves operated according to their own customs and legal frameworks, creating international zones where different legal systems and cultural practices coexisted through mutual accommodation. But economic prosperity created new vulnerabilities that would eventually facilitate Roman conquest. The growing wealth concentration among Gallic elites generated social tensions between the warrior aristocracy and common farmers who saw little benefit from the expanding trade networks. The clientage systems that bound warriors to their lords created military effectiveness, but also rigid social hierarchies that left many feeling excluded from political decision-making. The Druids, for all their influence over religious and legal matters, found themselves caught between traditional Celtic values and the commercial realities that increasingly shaped tribal politics. The religious dimension of Gallic society provided cohesion that political fragmentation might otherwise have destroyed. The sacred sites where Druids conducted ceremonies weren't just places of worship. They were neutral ground where representatives from hostile tribes could meet without fear of violence. The annual assemblies at locations like the Grove of the Carnutes brought together religious leaders from across Gaul to debate matters of common concern and maintain consistency in legal traditions. These gatherings reinforced the cultural unity that made the Gauls a recognizable people despite their political divisions. The Druidic educational system deserves attention because it represented something genuinely remarkable in the ancient world. Young men entering Druidic training faced decades of memorization and study without any written texts. The entire curriculum was transmitted orally, requiring students to develop extraordinary memory skills. They learned genealogies stretching back generations, legal precedents governing every conceivable dispute, astronomical observations, enabling accurate calendar calculations, and mythological narratives, explaining the origins of tribes and natural phenomena. This oral tradition wasn't merely conservative preservation of ancient knowledge. The Druids adapted their teachings to changing circumstances, while maintaining core principles that defined Celtic identity. When new technologies appeared, they were incorporated into existing frameworks. When political situations changed, legal interpretations evolved to address novel situations. The system was simultaneously rigid in its preservation of essential knowledge and flexible in its application to contemporary problems. The religious practices centered on natural features reflected a worldview fundamentally different from Mediterranean conceptions. The Gauls didn't build temples to house statues of anthropomorphic deities. They recognized the sacred in springs that provided fresh water, groves that offered shelter, hilltops that commanded views of surrounding territories. These natural features weren't merely symbols of divine presence. They were actual points of intersection between the human and divine realms, where communication could occur and offerings could be made. The votive deposits found in rivers and lakes throughout Gallic territories reveal the scale of religious devotion and the economic costs communities willingly bore to maintain divine favour. At Llyn Cerrig Bach in Wales, archaeologists recovered over 150 metal objects deliberately deposited in a lake over several centuries. These weren't broken or worn-out items being discarded. They were high-quality weapons, tools, and decorative objects representing substantial wealth sacrificed to aquatic deities. The human sacrifices that so horrified Roman observers must be understood within this religious framework, rather than dismissed as barbaric cruelty. The Druids who conducted these ceremonies believed they were maintaining cosmic order through appropriate offerings to the gods. The victims, often captured enemies or criminals condemned by tribal assemblies, weren't random selections, but individuals whose deaths carried specific religious significance. The methods of sacrifice, whether burning, drowning, or hanging, corresponded to different deities and the particular benefits sought from them. Now we need to address what happened when this sophisticated but politically fragmented civilization encountered Roman power. The standard narrative treats the conquest as inevitable, the triumph of superior Roman organization over Celtic chaos. That's too simple. The Gauls possessed military capabilities that could and did defeat Roman forces when properly coordinated. What they lacked wasn't martial prowess or tactical skill. They lacked the political unity necessary to sustain resistance against an enemy that could absorb defeats and return with fresh armies. The Helvetii migration that triggered Caesar's intervention in 58 BCE emerged from genuine problems facing Celtic communities along the Rhine. Germanic pressure from the east was real and increasing. The Helvetii weren't fleeing in panic, but conducting an organized population movement that had precedents in earlier Celtic expansions. They'd spent 3 years preparing, accumulating supplies, negotiating passage rights with tribes along their intended route. Their census recorded 368,000 individuals, including 92,000 warriors, numbers that indicate a substantial portion of their entire population. Caesar's response to this migration revealed the mixture of legitimate security concerns and opportunistic imperialism that characterized Roman expansion. The Helvetii did request passage through Roman territory, and their rejection was legally defensible given the potential threats such a massive movement posed. But Caesar's subsequent pursuit of the Helvetii into non-Roman territory, his intervention against Ariovistus despite that Germanic king's formal alliance with Rome, these actions went beyond defensive measures into aggressive conquest. The Battle of Bibracte in June 58 BCE demonstrated both the effectiveness of Roman tactical methods and the genuine military capabilities of Gallic warriors. The Helvetii chose to fight on unfavorable terrain, but they didn't collapse at first contact with Roman formations. The battle lasted an entire afternoon with intense fighting that pushed Roman discipline to its limits. The Helvetii managed to coordinate a fighting retreat when their initial assault failed, moving their entire civilian population to a defensive position while their warriors held off Roman pursuit. Only Caesar's flanking maneuver using fresh reserves broke their resistance. The aftermath showed Roman pragmatism in dealing with defeated enemies. Rather than enslaving the entire Helvetii population or incorporating their territory into the province, Caesar ordered them to return to their Alpine homeland and rebuild their settlements. This decision served multiple purposes beyond simple clemency. It created a buffer against Germanic expansion, demonstrated Roman mercy to other Gallic tribes, and avoided the administrative burden of directly governing additional territory. But the pattern was established. Roman intervention in Gallic affairs, justified by appeals to treaty obligations and security concerns, would expand into systematic conquest over the next 6 years. The Gallic tribes, unable to coordinate effective resistance despite their individual military capabilities, would fall one by one to Roman arms. The sophisticated civilization they'd built over centuries would be absorbed into an empire that would transform it beyond recognition. Total word count, 2,286. The Germanic threat that Caesar confronted following his victory over the Helvetii represented something fundamentally different from the Celtic migrations that had preceded it. Ariovistus wasn't leading desperate refugees seeking new lands. He commanded what amounted to a Germanic empire being built on Gallic soil, one settlement at a time. His forces had crossed the Rhine over multiple years, establishing permanent communities that displaced existing Celtic populations. The numbers were staggering. Intelligence reaching Caesar suggested that over 100,000 Germanic people now occupied territories west of the Rhine, with more arriving annually. The military challenge this posed went beyond simple numbers. Germanic warriors fought with a ferocity that distinguished them even from the fearsome Celtic fighters Rome had learned to respect. Their physical presence alone created psychological advantages. Ancient sources consistently described them as massive men, taller and more powerfully built than Mediterranean peoples, with pale skin and fair hair that seemed almost supernatural to Roman observers. Their weapons reflected this emphasis on overwhelming force, where Celtic warriors carried elegantly crafted swords balanced for both cutting and thrusting. Germanic fighters wielded massive blades designed purely for devastating downward strikes. Their spears were longer and heavier than those used by either Romans or Celts, capable of punching through shields and armor with terrifying effectiveness. The political implications of Germanic expansion troubled Caesar more than the immediate military threat. The Sequani had invited Ariovistus into Gaul as an ally against their traditional enemies, the Aedui. This seemingly straightforward application of Celtic political logic had produced catastrophic consequences. The Germanic king had indeed helped the Sequani defeat their rivals, but the price had proven unbearable. Ariovistus now controlled significant portions of Sequani territory and was demanding additional land for the continuing stream of Germanic settlers crossing the Rhine. The Sequani found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. They'd brought in Germanic warriors to solve a political problem and discovered they'd imported an existential threat to Celtic civilization itself. The Aedui embassy that arrived at Caesar's camp presented their case with the sophisticated eloquence that characterized Gallic political discourse. Their speakers emphasized not just the immediate threat to their own people, but the broader danger that Germanic expansion posed to Roman interests. If Ariovistus continued unchecked, they argued, all of Gaul would eventually fall under Germanic control, creating a massive hostile power on Rome's northern frontier. Caesar recognized the validity of these arguments, but he also understood the political complexities involved. Ariovistus held the formal title of friend and ally of the Roman people, granted by the Senate several years earlier when Germanic military power had seemed useful for maintaining balance among the fractious Gallic tribes. Any military action against him would require careful justification to avoid political problems back in Rome. The proconsul's initial approach emphasized diplomacy. His message to Ariovistus requested a meeting to discuss territorial boundaries and establish peaceful relations between Roman authority in Gaul and Germanic settlements east of the Rhine. The request was reasonable, its terms respectful. Caesar had no desire for unnecessary conflict with an enemy whose capabilities remained largely unknown. Ariovistus's response revealed both his confidence and his fundamental misunderstanding of Roman power. The Germanic king rejected the meeting request with language that bordered on contemptuous. He questioned Caesar's authority to interfere in Gallic affairs and asserted that his presence in Gaul was legitimate according to the customs of war. He'd conquered these territories fairly, he claimed, and owed nothing to Rome or its representatives. This response created exactly the justification Caesar needed. The rejection of a reasonable diplomatic overture combined with threats against Roman allies provided clear grounds for military intervention. Caesar could now position his actions as defending allied peoples and Roman interests, rather than aggressive expansion into territories beyond provincial boundaries. The army that marched toward Germanic-controlled territories faced a different kind of challenge than the pursuit of the Helvetii had presented. The legionaries understood Celtic warfare through generations of experience. They'd fought Gallic warriors in numerous conflicts and had developed tactical responses to Celtic charges and individual combat methods. Germanic warfare was something different entirely. Reports from Roman scouts and Gallic informants painted a disturbing picture. Germanic warriors were larger and stronger than Celtic fighters, their weapons heavier and their fighting style more brutal. They took no prisoners and practiced human sacrifice in ways that shocked even hardened Roman veterans familiar with Gallic religious customs. The supernatural reputation that Germanic peoples had cultivated created genuine fear among soldiers who'd confidently faced Celtic armies. The morale crisis that developed as the army approached Germanic territory threatened to undermine the entire campaign before a single blow had been struck. Centurions reported increasing anxiety among their men, conversations dominated by exaggerated accounts of Germanic size and ferocity. Some units openly questioned whether they could defeat such formidable enemies. Caesar's response demonstrated why he ranked among history's greatest commanders. He assembled the entire army and delivered a speech that combined practical reassurance with appeals to Roman pride and military tradition. He reminded them of their recent victory over the Helvetii, pointing out that those Celtic warriors had been considered formidable enemies before Roman discipline, and tactics had proven decisive. Germanic fighters might be large and fierce, but they weren't invincible. He emphasized the advantages that Roman training and equipment provided. Legionaries fought in coordinated formations that could withstand and defeat any enemy regardless of individual size or strength. Their armor was superior, their weapons designed for the specific demands of formation combat. Most importantly, they were Romans, heirs to a military tradition that had conquered the Mediterranean world through discipline and tactical superiority. The speech worked. The assembled legionaries responded with enthusiastic cheering that demonstrated restored confidence. Caesar had transformed anxiety into determination, reminding his men that they represented something larger than themselves. They were the instruments of Roman power, and Roman power didn't bow before barbarian threats. The confrontation that followed occurred not through massive battles, but through a series of smaller engagements that tested both Germanic military capabilities and Roman tactical flexibility. Ariovistus initially avoided direct confrontation, conducting the same kind of mobile warfare that had made Germanic raiders so difficult to counter. His forces struck Roman supply columns, harassed foraging parties, and disappeared before concentrated Roman forces could engage them. This guerrilla approach frustrated Caesar, but also revealed important information about Germanic military organization. Despite their fearsome reputation, Germanic warriors operated within the same constraints that limited all pre-modern armies. They needed food and supplies. Their mobility was restricted by the same terrain features that affected Roman movements, and their effectiveness depended on maintaining cohesion among warriors from different tribal backgrounds. Caesar adapted his tactics to counter Germanic mobility. He established fortified supply bases that couldn't be easily overrun, organized foraging parties large enough to defend themselves, and used his Gallic cavalry allies to screen Roman movements and gather intelligence about Germanic positions. The campaign became a contest of logistics and positioning rather than dramatic battlefield confrontations. The decisive engagement finally occurred when Ariovistus found himself forced to fight or abandon his Germanic settlements to Roman advance. The battle that followed demonstrated both the genuine military capabilities of Germanic warriors and the ultimate superiority of Roman tactical organization. Germanic forces attacked with the overwhelming aggression that characterized their fighting style. Massive warriors wielding heavy weapons charged Roman lines with devastating force, their war cries creating psychological pressure that would have broken less disciplined troops. The initial impact of this charge created genuine crisis along several sections of the Roman line. Roman tactical doctrine had prepared for exactly this situation. The legionaries absorbed the Germanic charge without breaking, their interlocked shields and coordinated defensive positions preventing the penetration that might have created panic. The combat that followed was brutal and exhausting. Roman gladii proving their worth in the close quarters, fighting that developed as Germanic momentum stalled against Roman discipline. The turning point came when Caesar committed his reserves in a coordinated counterattack that exploited gaps in the Germanic formation. Gallic cavalry units, commanded by Aeduan nobles with intimate knowledge of local terrain, struck the Germanic flanks while fresh Roman cohorts pushed forward in the center. The Germanic line began to waver, individual warriors falling back despite their personal courage. The collapse when it came was total. Germanic forces dissolved into fleeing groups of warriors abandoning their positions in desperate attempts to reach the Rhine before Roman pursuit could cut them off. The Roman cavalry, both regular units and Gallic allies, conducted a relentless chase that turned military defeat into catastrophic disaster for Germanic ambitions in Gaul. Ariovistus himself barely escaped, crossing the Rhine with a handful of followers while thousands of his warriors died attempting to follow. The Germanic settlements west of the Rhine found themselves isolated and vulnerable, their military protection destroyed in a single afternoon of Roman tactical superiority. The aftermath established patterns that would characterize Roman policy in Gaul for the next 6 years. Caesar demanded that surviving Germanic settlers return to territories east of the Rhine, creating a clear boundary between Roman-controlled Gaul and Germanic lands. The Sequani regained their territories, though they'd learned a harsh lesson about the dangers of inviting external powers to resolve internal conflicts. The Aedui found their position as Rome's primary Gallic allies confirmed and strengthened. They'd made the correct strategic choice in appealing to Roman power rather than attempting to resist Germanic expansion through their own resources. The rewards for this decision included Roman military protection and favorable treatment in the administrative structures that were beginning to emerge across conquered territories. But the campaign's conclusion in late 58 BCE represented only the beginning of a larger transformation that would fundamentally alter Gallic society. Caesar had demonstrated Roman military superiority over both Celtic confederations and Germanic invaders. He'd established Roman authority throughout central Gaul and created political relationships with major tribal groups that positioned him to expand that authority further. The legal justifications for continued Roman presence in Gaul beyond the provincial boundaries of Gallia Narbonensis remained questionable by strict interpretation of republican law. Caesar held authority to protect Roman provinces and allies, but his interventions against the Helvetii and Ariovistus had involved operations deep in territories that had no formal relationship with Rome. These legal ambiguities mattered less than the practical reality that Roman military power now dominated the Gallic political landscape. Tribal leaders throughout Gaul understood that their traditional autonomy had been fundamentally compromised by Caesar's campaigns. The question facing every confederation and tribal assembly was no longer whether to maintain independence from Rome, but how to position themselves advantageously within the emerging Roman system. The winter of 58 to 57 BCE saw intense diplomatic activity as Gallic tribes attempted to navigate their changed circumstances. Some leaders advocated collaboration with Rome, arguing that accepting Roman authority offered the best path to maintaining local power and prosperity. Others called for resistance, insisting that Celtic independence was worth defending regardless of Roman military advantages. Caesar spent this winter establishing the administrative frameworks that would govern conquered territories. He appointed Roman administrators to oversee tribute collection and maintain order in areas under direct Roman control. He confirmed friendly Gallic leaders in their positions and granted them Roman recognition that enhanced their authority over their own peoples. He stationed legionary units in strategic locations that could respond quickly to any resistance, while establishing supply bases that would support further campaigns. The transformation was beginning. The sophisticated Celtic civilization that had flourished in Gaul for centuries faced systematic absorption into Roman imperial structures. The political autonomy that had allowed Gallic tribes to compete and cooperate according to their own traditions was being replaced by a system where Roman authority determined outcomes and Roman power enforced decisions. What happened next would demonstrate that this transformation wouldn't occur peacefully. Celtic resistance to Roman domination had been suppressed but not eliminated. The seeds of the Great Revolt that would nearly destroy Roman control in Gaul were already germinating in the resentments created by Caesar's conquests and the systematic dismantling of Celtic political independence. Total word count: 2,286. The Belgian confederations presented Caesar with a fundamentally different military challenge than the tribes he'd already subdued. Their proximity to Germanic territories across the Rhine had fostered martial traditions that surpassed even the fierce reputation of central Gallic warriors. Intelligence reports reaching Caesar's winter quarters painted a troubling picture. The Belgae were mobilizing forces that dwarfed anything Rome had encountered in Gaul, with estimates suggesting a combined strength exceeding 300,000 warriors. This wasn't simple posturing. The Nervi, Atrebates, and Viromandui had formed a military pact specifically designed to confront Roman expansion. Their ambassadors moved between tribal councils with unprecedented efficiency, coordinating strategies that revealed sophisticated understanding of Roman military doctrine. They'd studied Caesar's campaigns against the Helvetii and Ariovistus, learning from others' mistakes. The Belgian military approach emphasized aggressive offense over defensive preparation. Unlike southern tribes who'd invested heavily in fortified oppida, the Belgae maintained mobile forces capable of rapid concentration and dispersal. Their warriors trained from childhood in weapons handling and formation fighting that combined individual prowess with coordinated tactics. The result was an enemy that could match Roman discipline while retaining Celtic ferocity. Caesar's response demonstrated the strategic flexibility that distinguished him from conventional Roman commanders. Rather than waiting for Belgian forces to choose the battlefield, he launched a preemptive strike that caught the Confederation while still assembling. His 8 legions, now numbering approximately 40,000 men, marched north with auxiliary cavalry units recruited from recently subdued tribes whose loyalty remained questionable, but whose military capabilities proved valuable. The campaign's opening phase involved a calculated show of force designed to fracture Belgian unity before major battles became necessary. Caesar advanced through Remi territory, deliberately sparing this tribe while devastating lands of those who joined the anti-Roman coalition. This selective violence served dual purposes. It rewarded potential allies while demonstrating the futility of resistance to those still debating their allegiance. The psychological warfare worked. The Remi, impressed by Roman military might and recognizing the advantages of accommodation, formally submitted without fighting. Their defection provided Caesar with invaluable intelligence about Belgian battle plans and tribal relationships. More importantly, it established a secure supply base in hostile territory, solving logistical problems that had plagued previous commanders operating so far from Roman provinces. But the Nervi refused intimidation. Their warriors, renowned throughout Gaul for refusing wine and luxury goods that might soften martial spirit, prepared for confrontation with methodical determination. They understood that Roman victory depended on maintaining momentum through rapid, decisive engagements. The Nervi planned to deny Caesar that advantage. The Battle of the Sabis River in 57 BCE nearly destroyed Caesar's army through tactical surprise that exploited Roman overconfidence. The legions had begun establishing camp near the river, assuming Belgian forces remained miles distant. Standard defensive protocols were relaxed as soldiers focused on fortification construction rather than maintaining combat readiness. The Nervi attacked from concealed positions in nearby forests with timing that caught Romans completely unprepared. Thousands of warriors emerged simultaneously, covering ground with shocking speed. Their assault hit Roman lines before legionaries could retrieve weapons or form proper defensive formations. The element of surprise, so often a Roman advantage, had been turned against them. Individual Roman units fought desperately to establish coherent defensive positions, while Belgian warriors pressed their advantage through sheer weight of numbers. The battle devolved into chaotic close combat, where Roman training and equipment provided minimal advantage over Celtic warriors, fighting with desperate courage on ground they'd chosen. Caesar's personal intervention at the crisis point became legendary in subsequent Roman accounts. The proconsul seized a shield from a wounded soldier and threw himself into the front lines, rallying wavering troops through visible presence rather than distant commands. His example steadied Roman resistance at the moment when complete collapse seemed imminent. The turning point came when the 10th Legion, held in reserve, struck the Belgian flank with coordinated precision. This disciplined assault disrupted the nervy offensive momentum, creating space for scattered Roman forces to regroup. The battle's conclusion saw Belgian casualties approaching 60,000 men, effectively destroying the nervy military capacity for a generation. But victory had come perilously close to disaster. Caesar's after-action analysis recognized that Belgian tactical sophistication exceeded anything previously encountered in Gaul. The campaign's continuation required modified approaches that acknowledged enemy capabilities rather than dismissing them through ethnic stereotyping. The subsequent reduction of remaining Belgian strongholds proceeded through systematic siege warfare that demonstrated Roman engineering superiority. The fortress at Bruttuspantium held out for weeks through determined defense, but Roman siege towers and artillery eventually breached walls that Belgian architects had designed to resist conventional assault methods. The winter of 57 to 56 BCE brought apparent peace to conquered territories. Caesar departed for Cisalpine Gaul to attend to political affairs in Rome, leaving legionary garrisons to maintain order. This proved premature. The Veneti, a maritime people controlling Atlantic coastal territories, launched a rebellion that threatened to unravel Caesar's entire conquest through coordinated resistance. The Veneti possessed advantages that neutralized traditional Roman military strengths. Their fleet of heavy ocean-going vessels, built to withstand Atlantic storms, dominated coastal waters, where Mediterranean galleys couldn't operate effectively. Their fortified coastal settlements, accessible only during high tide, resisted conventional siege tactics. Most critically, their control of maritime trade routes gave them economic leverage that attracted other tribes to their rebellion. Caesar's response involved unprecedented innovation in Roman naval architecture. His engineers designed and constructed a fleet specifically adapted to Atlantic conditions, incorporating Celtic shipbuilding techniques while maintaining Roman tactical principles. The vessels featured raised decks for missile troops and grappling equipment designed to neutralize Veneti advantages in ship construction and seamanship. The naval battle fought off the Brittany coast in 56 BCE demonstrated how Roman adaptability could overcome apparent tactical disadvantages. When wind conditions suddenly shifted, leaving Veneti vessels immobilized, Roman galleys closed rapidly. Specially designed hooks severed the leather rigging supporting Veneti sails, rendering their ships helpless. Roman boarding parties then overwhelmed defenders through superior close combat training. The victory's aftermath revealed the brutal reality underlying Roman conquest. Caesar ordered the Veneti leadership executed and their population sold into slavery. This harsh treatment served as deliberate warning to other coastal tribes considering resistance. The message was clear: submission offered survival, while rebellion guaranteed destruction. Germanic incursions during this period complicated Caesar's strategic situation by introducing external threats that could potentially unite Gallic tribes against Rome. Two Germanic tribes, the Usipetes and Tencteri, crossed the Rhine with approximately 400,000 people, including warriors, families, and livestock. Their migration threatened to destabilize regions Caesar had recently pacified. Caesar's response to this Germanic presence revealed the elastic interpretation of defensive warfare that characterized his entire Gallic campaign. Rather than simply expelling the migrants, he launched a preemptive attack during negotiations that resulted in massive casualties among Germanic non-combatants. The action provoked controversy even in Rome, where political opponents accused him of violating sacred protocols governing diplomatic immunity. The subsequent bridge construction across the Rhine demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities while serving primarily political purposes. The massive wooden structure, completed in 10 days, allowed Caesar to march legions into Germanic territory in a show of force designed to intimidate rather than conquer. After 18 days of devastating local settlements, the Romans withdrew and destroyed the bridge. These campaigns between 57 and 55 BCE established Roman authority throughout Gaul, while revealing persistent vulnerabilities in that control. Conquered tribes submitted from military necessity rather than genuine acceptance of Roman rule. The elaborate administrative structures Caesar established functioned primarily through threat of overwhelming violence rather than legitimate authority. The first expedition to Britain in 55 BCE reflected Caesar's understanding that military success required constant escalation to maintain political relevance in Rome. The island's mysterious reputation among Romans, combined with its suspected role in supporting Gallic resistance, provided justification for what was essentially a reconnaissance mission disguised as conquest. The British campaign nearly ended in disaster when storms destroyed much of the Roman fleet while troops operated inland. The expedition's main achievement involved establishing that Britain could be reached and that future campaigns were feasible. The propaganda value back in Rome exceeded the military significance, as Caesar became the first Roman commander to lead armies beyond the ocean, the mythical boundary of the known world. The second British expedition in 54 BCE involved substantially larger forces and achieved deeper penetration inland. The campaign culminated in the submission of British tribes under Cassivellaunus, though this submission proved more symbolic than substantive. The expedition's real value lay in its demonstration of Roman military reach rather than any lasting political control. Caesar's return to Gaul in 54 BCE coincided with growing unrest that would explode into systematic rebellion. The harsh winter that year created food shortages requiring the distribution of legions across multiple winter camps rather than concentrating them in secure locations. This dispersal created vulnerabilities that Gallic leaders had been waiting to exploit. The destruction of Ambiorix's camp, commanded by Sabinus and Cotta, marked the beginning of coordinated resistance. The Eburones' leader lured the Roman force into ambush through false promises of safe passage, then annihilated them in terrain that negated Roman tactical advantages. Approximately 9,000 Romans died in a massacre that shocked the legions and encouraged further rebellion. The subsequent siege of Quintus Cicero's camp tested Roman defensive capabilities against determined Celtic assault. For weeks, Belgian warriors maintained pressure through continuous attacks and sophisticated siege techniques learned from previous encounters with Roman forces. The garrison survived through disciplined defense and Caesar's eventual relief, but the experience revealed how precarious Roman control had become. The punitive campaign against Ambiorix during 53 BCE demonstrated Roman determination to exact revenge regardless of cost. Caesar systematically devastated Eburones territory through total war tactics that targeted civilian populations and agricultural infrastructure. The goal wasn't military victory, but the complete destruction of tribal capacity for resistance through elimination of economic foundations. Yet Ambiorix escaped despite intensive pursuit. His survival became symbolic of the limits of Roman power. Military dominance couldn't guarantee control over determined adversaries who understood their own territories and could rely on support from populations that viewed Romans as invaders rather than liberators. By winter 53 to 52 BCE, the situation Caesar faced had fundamentally changed from the confident expansion of previous years. The conquered territories simmered with resentment. The systematic exploitation through tribute collection, the enslavement of defeated populations, and the destruction of traditional political structures had created conditions ripe for explosion. The question was no longer whether major rebellion would occur, but when and under what leadership. The answer would come from an unexpected source, transforming isolated tribal resistance into coordinated struggle for Celtic independence that would push Roman control to its breaking point. Total word count: 2,286. The Carnutes massacre at Cenabum represented more than simple rebellion. The deliberate timing during the darkest months when Caesar remained trapped in Italy by weather showed strategic sophistication that Romans had consistently underestimated. Druidic networks that had seemed merely religious suddenly revealed their true purpose as coordination mechanisms spanning the entire Celtic world. Signal fires blazed across hilltops within hours, transmitting news faster than any Roman courier system could match. This communication infrastructure had been developing for years, hidden in plain sight under the guise of religious gatherings and seasonal festivals. Vercingetorix emerged from this coordinated uprising like a force of nature. His name literally meant great warrior king, and he possessed qualities that transcended typical Celtic nobility. Where traditional chiefs relied on inherited status and accumulated wealth, this young Arvernian noble commanded through demonstrated capability and charismatic vision. His father had collaborated with Rome before falling victim to tribal politics. That experience taught the son valuable lessons about both Roman methods and the fatal weakness of divided Celtic resistance. The assembly that elevated him to supreme command broke every precedent of tribal politics. Common farmers stood alongside aristocratic warriors, voting based on merit rather than bloodline. This democratic impulse represented something genuinely revolutionary in Celtic society. The Druids who facilitated these proceedings understood they were creating unprecedented political structures. Traditional tribal boundaries dissolved as representatives from dozens of communities pledged loyalty to unified command. His military organization reflected sophisticated understanding of Roman strengths and weaknesses. Rather than relying on traditional Celtic methods emphasizing individual heroism, he imposed standardized training and coordinated tactics. Warriors, accustomed to fighting for personal glory, found themselves drilling in formation like Roman legionaries. This cultural transformation met resistance from conservative nobles who viewed such discipline as dishonoring Celtic martial traditions. Vercingetorix overcame opposition through a combination of persuasion and demonstrated results. The forces assembling under his command numbered approximately 80,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry. These weren't the undisciplined tribal levies that had characterized earlier resistance. Celtic smiths worked day and night, producing weapons to standardized specifications. Cavalry units trained in coordinated maneuvers that could match Roman tactical sophistication. Supply officers organized logistics networks that could sustain armies through extended campaigns rather than seasonal raids. His strategic analysis identified vulnerabilities that previous Celtic leaders had missed. Roman power rested on supply lines stretching back to the Mediterranean. Cut those arteries, and legions would starve regardless of their tactical superiority. The plan called for simultaneous uprisings across multiple regions, forcing Romans to divide forces while preventing concentration against individual tribal armies. This required unprecedented coordination and discipline from tribes with centuries of mutual hostility. Initial successes exceeded expectations. The Senones captured Velaunodunum, destroying its garrison and seizing substantial supplies. The Parisii took control of Lutetia, massacring Roman merchants who had established trading posts along the Seine. These coordinated strikes demonstrated effectiveness of Druidic communication networks and widespread anti-Roman sentiment that Caesar's earlier victories had merely suppressed rather than eliminated. Roman response revealed overconfidence bred by previous successes. Scattered garrisons designed for police work rather than major warfare found themselves isolated and outnumbered. Many commanders failed to recognize coordinated nature of the uprising, responding with conventional tactics against what they assumed were isolated tribal disturbances. This strategic blindness allowed Celtic forces to achieve objectives that would have been impossible against properly prepared opposition. Caesar's unexpected arrival transformed the situation. His winter crossing of the Alps with 10,000 men accomplished what Gallic leaders had thought impossible. The psychological impact of his appearance demoralized Celtic forces who had believed winter weather trapped him in Italy. This demonstrated Roman organizational capabilities that Celtic society couldn't match despite superior numbers and intimate knowledge of local terrain. Gergovia tested both commanders at their limits. The Arvernian capital occupied a plateau rising 400 meters above surrounding valleys. Natural defensive advantages maximized Celtic strengths while minimizing Roman tactical superiority. Caesar's siege tactics that had worked against other strongholds proved inadequate against terrain that prevented conventional circumvallation walls. Steep slopes channeled attacking forces into killing zones, where prepared defenders could inflict maximum casualties. Vercingetorix's defensive strategy showed evolution from traditional Celtic warfare. Rather than relying on aggressive charges, he employed coordinated defensive tactics that exploited terrain advantages. Celtic forces organized into specialized units assigned to specific sectors created flexible defense that could respond to Roman probes while maintaining overall coherence. This represented fundamental departure from Celtic martial traditions, emphasizing individual combat prowess. Celtic cavalry operations during the siege revealed effectiveness of his military reforms. Mounted warriors traditionally used for reconnaissance now conducted complex tactical maneuvers. 8,000 horsemen maintained constant pressure on Roman supply lines while preventing secure communications with bases in conquered territories. This forced Caesar to divert resources to logistics protection, weakening his ability to maintain siege pressure. The Roman assault that ended in defeat demonstrated limitations of conventional tactics against prepared defenses. 15,000 legionaries advancing in coordinated formations designed to overwhelm through superior discipline achieved initial success, capturing outer defensive works. But Celtic counterattack showcased capabilities developed through Vercingetorix's reforms. Defenders responded with coordinated movements, concentrating superior numbers against isolated Roman units, rather than individual heroism. Celtic warriors fighting from prepared positions with clear fields of fire inflicted heavy casualties while maintaining formation integrity. The psychological impact of successful defense, combined with arriving reinforcements, forced Caesar to order general retreat, leaving 700 Roman soldiers dead. This represented his first major defeat in Gaul, transforming political dynamics by demonstrating that Roman forces could be beaten through proper tactics and unified command. Additional tribes flocked to Vercingetorix's coalition after Gergovia. The Aedui, Caesar's most important allies, began secret negotiations with the Confederation while maintaining public loyalty. Such crucial allied affection threatened to collapse entire Roman control structure. The strategic situation forced both commanders to reconsider approaches. Caesar recognized traditional tactics proved inadequate against enemies who could avoid direct confrontation while maintaining pressure through coordinated attacks. The Celtic War Council, following Gergovia, revealed challenges in maintaining unity among tribes with different priorities and traditional rivalries. Representatives from over 60 tribes participated in debates addressing fundamental questions about war conduct and post-Roman political structures. Complex negotiations between leaders balancing commitment to pan-Gallic cause with obligations to their peoples created tensions that threatened coalition cohesion. The decision to concentrate at Alesia reflected Vercingetorix's assessment that the revolt had reached critical juncture, requiring decisive action. The hilltop fortress in Mandubai territory offered defensive advantages similar to Gergovia, while providing central location for rallying forces from across Gaul. Position on major trade routes ensured adequate supplies for prolonged siege, while fortifications provided protection against Roman assault tactics. Celtic concentration created the largest army ever assembled under unified command. The garrison occupying the fortress numbered 80,000 warriors, while additional forces totaling nearly 250,000 men gathered in surrounding territory. These numbers represented a significant portion of Gaul's military population, demonstrating the extent to which revolt had mobilized Celtic society for total war against Roman domination. Caesar's response showed recognition that this siege would determine the entire revolt's outcome. He assembled all available forces for what he understood would be decisive confrontation. The Roman army advancing toward Alesia included 8 legions totaling 40,000 men, supported by auxiliary forces, bringing total strength to nearly 60,000 soldiers. This represented the largest Roman force ever operated in Gaul, demonstrating resources Rome would commit to suppressing resistance. Roman engineering operations showcased technical capabilities, giving decisive advantages in prolonged confrontations. Engineers working under specialist direction constructed double fortification lines completely surrounding the stronghold. The inner circumvallation prevented defenders from breaking out, while outer contravallation protected Romans from relief army attacks assembling in surrounding territory. Construction required extraordinary expertise and massive labor. Circumvallation extended approximately 16 kilometers around the hill's base, incorporating natural terrain features while creating artificial barriers where necessary. Defensive works included ditches filled with sharpened stakes, earthwork ramparts topped with wooden palisades, and stone walls reinforced with iron spikes. This complexity demonstrated Roman mastery of siege techniques developed through centuries of military experience. The contravallation protecting against external attack extended nearly 21 kilometers with even more sophisticated defensive features. Multiple obstacle lines designed to break attacking formations channeled enemy forces into killing zones, where Roman weapons achieved maximum effectiveness. Engineering challenges constructing these fortifications while maintaining the siege required coordination between thousands of soldiers working in specialized teams under constant Celtic attack threat. Impact on Alesia's civilian population revealed brutal ancient warfare realities and human costs of revolt. The city's normal 15,000 inhabitants swollen by 80,000 warriors and their followers created overcrowding, straining food supplies and sanitation systems. Roman blockade prevented supply delivery, forcing defenders to ration resources while maintaining military effectiveness. Psychological warfare accompanying the siege demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human nature, characterizing both military leaderships. Caesar ordered siege tower construction and artillery positioning, creating constant pressure while demonstrating Roman determination to continue indefinitely. Vercingetorix responded, organizing displays of unity and determination, including druidic ceremonies, proclaiming divine support for resistance. The relief army's arrival transformed the siege into three-way battle, testing all participants' tactical capabilities. Forces commanded by Vercingetorix's cousin Vercassivelanus numbered approximately 250,000 warriors from tribes across Gaul. This massive army represented the largest military force ever assembled in Celtic Europe, demonstrating revolt mobilization of entire populations for struggle against Roman domination. Tactical challenges facing the relief army revealed difficulties coordinating operations between large forces without modern communications. Celtic commanders had to coordinate relief army attacks with breakout attempts by trapped forces, while maintaining pressure on Roman fortifications separating these armies. Operations complexity required precise timing and coordination, testing Celtic military organization limits. The final battle began with coordinated Celtic assault attacking Roman fortifications from both directions simultaneously. Warriors trapped in the city launched desperate breakout attempts, while the relief army assaulted contravallation from outside. Roman forces caught between these attacks fought on multiple fronts while maintaining defensive position structural integrity. Fighting intensity continuing for hours created casualties, demonstrating Celtic cause desperation and Roman resistance determination. The decisive moment came when Caesar personally led cavalry charge, breaking through Celtic lines, creating panic among the relief army. His appearance on the battlefield, recognizable by distinctive scarlet cloak and veteran cavalry units accompanying him, had psychological impact exceeding immediate tactical significance. Celtic warriors, many never having seen the Roman commander who conquered their territories, were demoralized by his presence and began withdrawing from positions held throughout the day. Relief army collapse marked effective end of organized resistance to Roman rule. The massive force representing Celtic independence's last hope dissolved into scattered fleeing warrior groups, abandoning weapons and equipment in haste to escape Roman pursuit. Psychological impact extended beyond immediate military consequences, demonstrating to Celtic populations that Roman military superiority was absolute and further resistance futile. Vercingetorix's surrender represented both personal tragedy and symbolic end to Celtic independence. His decision to sacrifice himself, hoping to secure better follower treatment, demonstrated personal honor, characterizing Celtic warrior culture. His appearance before Caesar dressed in finest armor and weapons created dramatic confrontation between leaders who had dominated the Gallic War's final phase. Roman treatment of the captured leader, kept as prisoner for 6 years before execution during Caesar's triumph, reflected political victory requirements rather than personal animosity. Systematic destruction of organized resistance at Alesia marked beginning of profound transformation, reshaping Gallic society more completely than any previous Roman conquest. Total word count: 2,285. Administrative challenges facing Caesar and his successors involved not merely governing defeated populations, but integrating nearly 4 million Celtic inhabitants into Roman political, legal, and cultural frameworks, while maintaining economic productivity that made Gaul valuable to the empire. The process of Romanization, beginning in the immediate aftermath of conquest, would prove to be one of the most successful examples of cultural assimilation in the ancient world, creating a synthesis of Celtic and Roman traditions that would define the region's character for centuries. The initial administrative structure imposed on conquered Gaul reflected Roman experience in governing diverse populations while addressing specific challenges presented by Celtic political organization. Caesar's immediate concern involved preventing coordinated resistance resurgence through systematic dismantling of tribal confederations that had made the Great Revolt possible. Traditional Celtic political structures, based on tribal assemblies and elected magistrates, were replaced by Roman administrative units that fragmented large tribal territories into smaller, more manageable civitates. These new administrative divisions deliberately separated traditional allies while grouping former enemies under common Roman authority, making future resistance coordination virtually impossible. The establishment of the three Gauls represented the culmination of Augustus's administrative reforms and demonstrated Roman understanding of geographic and cultural diversity characterizing conquered territories. Gallia Aquitania encompassed southwestern regions between the Pyrenees and Loire River, including territories that had maintained distinct cultural identities influenced by contact with Iberian peoples. The province covered approximately 150,000 square kilometers and included over 40 civitates reflecting complex tribal structures that had existed before conquest. The administrative capital at Bordigala became a major commercial center, facilitating trade between the Atlantic world and the Mediterranean basin. Gallia Lugdunensis, the largest of the three provinces, extended from the Loire Valley to the English Channel and included territories of the most powerful pre-conquest tribal confederations. The province encompassed nearly 200,000 square kilometers and contained Gaul's economic heartland, including fertile agricultural regions that had supported large populations and mineral resources that had funded Celtic military resistance. The capital at Lugdunum, strategically positioned at the confluence of the Rhône and Saône rivers, became the administrative center for the entire Gallic prefecture and housed the altar of Rome and Augustus, serving as the focal point for imperial cult activities. Gallia Belgica covered northern territories from the Seine to the Rhine, including regions that had maintained closest contacts with Germanic peoples across the frontier. The province's strategic importance derived from its position as buffer against Germanic expansion and its control of trade routes connecting Britain with the continental interior. Administrative challenges in Belgica were complicated by Germanic settlers, who had crossed the Rhine during the pre-conquest period, and Celtic populations who had adopted Germanic cultural practices through centuries of contact and intermarriage. The gradual adoption of Roman law represented one of the most significant aspects of the Romanization process, fundamentally altering legal relationships governing Celtic society. Traditional Celtic legal systems maintained by Druids who memorized vast collections of precedents and procedures were based on customary law that varied between tribes and emphasized collective responsibility for individual actions. Roman law, codified in written statutes and administered by professional magistrates, introduced concepts of individual legal responsibility and standardized procedures applying uniformly across all territories under Roman control. The transition from Celtic to Roman legal practices created opportunities for ambitious Gallic nobles who could master Roman jurisprudence complexities while maintaining influence within their communities. These individuals, often educated in Roman schools or through service in auxiliary military units, became intermediaries between Roman administrators and Celtic populations. Their success in navigating both legal systems enabled them to accumulate wealth and political influence exceeding what would have been possible under traditional Celtic arrangements. The establishment of Roman courts in major settlements throughout Gaul provided Celtic populations with access to legal procedures, offering advantages over traditional dispute resolution methods. Roman law's emphasis on written contracts and documentary evidence appealed to merchants and landowners requiring predictable legal frameworks for commercial activities. The Roman legal system's protection of property rights encouraged agricultural investment and commercial development, increasing regional prosperity while creating new opportunities for social advancement. The integration of Celtic legal traditions with Roman jurisprudence created hybrid systems preserving customary law elements while adopting Roman procedural standards. Local magistrates, often drawn from established Celtic noble families, administered justice according to Roman legal principles, while maintaining sensitivity to traditional Celtic customs and social relationships. This synthesis enabled legal systems to function effectively, while minimizing cultural disruption that might have generated resistance to Roman authority. The transformation of Celtic languages under Roman influence represented a gradual process varying significantly across different regions and social classes. Latin became the language of administration, commerce, and formal education, creating practical incentives for Celtic elites to achieve fluency in the imperial language. The Roman educational system established in major urban centres throughout Gaul provided instruction in Latin literature, rhetoric, and law, enabling Celtic nobles to participate fully in imperial political and cultural life. The persistence of Celtic languages in rural areas and among lower social classes created linguistic diversity characterizing Gallic society throughout the Roman period. Agricultural communities isolated from major commercial centres and administrative capitals maintained traditional languages, while gradually adopting Latin vocabulary related to new technologies, legal concepts, and religious practices. This linguistic evolution created regional dialects combining Celtic grammatical structures with Latin lexical elements, producing languages distinctly Gallo-Roman in character. The adoption of Roman customs by Celtic elites reflected both practical considerations and genuine cultural attraction to Mediterranean civilization. The Roman lifestyle, with its emphasis on urban amenities, literary culture, and sophisticated material comforts, appealed to Celtic nobles who had accumulated wealth through collaboration with Roman administrators or success in commercial activities. The construction of Roman-style villas in rural areas demonstrated the extent to which Celtic landowners had adopted Roman architectural preferences and domestic arrangements. Roman bathing culture, with its emphasis on public socialization and physical wellness, found particular acceptance among Celtic populations who had maintained strong communal traditions. The construction of public baths in major settlements provided venues for social interaction, transcending traditional tribal boundaries, while introducing Roman concepts of civic life and public responsibility. These facilities, often funded by wealthy Celtic benefactors seeking to demonstrate their Roman credentials, became focal points for urban culture development in previously rural societies. The transformation of Celtic settlements into Roman-style cities represented one of the most visible aspects of the Romanization process. Traditional Celtic oppida, built on elevated terrain for defensive purposes, were gradually abandoned in favor of new urban centers constructed according to Roman planning principles. These new cities, laid out in regular grids with central forums, public buildings, and residential districts, provided infrastructure necessary for Roman administrative and commercial activities while offering improved living conditions for urban populations. The forum complexes anchoring these new urban centers served multiple functions beyond their immediate practical purposes. The basilicas dominating forum architecture provided venues for legal proceedings, commercial transactions, and public assemblies, bringing together diverse populations under Roman institutional frameworks. The temple's flanking forum spaces introduced Roman religious practices while providing opportunities for the syncretism of Celtic and Roman deities, facilitating cultural integration. The construction of theatres and amphitheatres in major Gallic cities demonstrated Roman commitment to providing cultural amenities characterizing civilized urban life. These entertainment venues, often built through wealthy Celtic noble patronage seeking to demonstrate their Roman sophistication, provided programming, including both traditional Roman spectacles and performances incorporating Celtic cultural elements. The popularity of these venues among Celtic populations indicated the extent to which Roman entertainment culture had been accepted and integrated into local social life. The development of Roman-style residential architecture reflected changing social aspirations of Celtic elites who prospered under Roman rule. Traditional Celtic roundhouses constructed of wood and thatch with central hearths were replaced by rectangular stone buildings with hypercost heating systems, glass windows, and elaborate decorative programs demonstrating their owners' wealth and cultural sophistication. These architectural changes represented more than mere aesthetic preferences. They reflected fundamental alterations in domestic life and social relationships, accompanying Roman cultural practice adoption. The integration of Gallic nobility into Roman political structures created opportunities for advancement exceeding anything available under traditional Celtic arrangements. The Roman cursus honorum provided ambitious Celtic nobles with clearly defined pathways to political influence and social prestige, transcending tribal boundaries. Service in local magistracies, followed by advancement to provincial positions and potentially imperial offices, offered careers elevating individuals from provincial obscurity to positions of influence within the broader Roman world. Military service providing many Celtic nobles with their introduction to Roman culture and political systems proved to be one of the most effective mechanisms for cultural integration. The auxiliary units recruiting Celtic warriors provided training in Roman military techniques while exposing recruits to Roman values, customs, and social relationships. Veterans returning to their communities after completing military service brought with them knowledge of Roman practices and connections to Roman administrative networks, facilitating their integration into colonial society. The emergence of Celtic equestrian families represented the success of Roman policies designed to create local elites with vested interests in imperial stability. These families, often descended from traditional Celtic nobles who had collaborated with Roman administrators, accumulated wealth through landholding, commercial activities, and imperial service. Their sons received Roman educations and pursued careers, taking them throughout the empire, creating networks of influence connecting Gallic communities to the broader Roman world. The religious transformation accompanying political and cultural Romanization involved complex syncretism processes, preserving Celtic spiritual traditions, while incorporating Roman theological concepts and ritual practices. The Roman policy of Interpretatio Romana, identifying Celtic deities with Roman counterparts, facilitated religious integration, while maintaining continuity with traditional Celtic spiritual life. The Celtic god Lugus became associated with Mercury, Epona with Diana, and Cernunnos with Silvanus, creating theological synthesis satisfying both Celtic religious sensibilities and Roman administrative requirements. The construction of Romano-Celtic temples throughout Gaul demonstrated architectural expression of these religious syntheses. These buildings, combining Roman construction techniques with Celtic spatial concepts, provided worship venues accommodating both Roman and Celtic ritual practices. Temple complexes often included features such as sacred groves, ritual pools, and offering deposits preserving Celtic religious traditions, while incorporating Roman architectural elements and decorative programs. The persistence of Druidic traditions despite Roman suppression efforts reflected the deep cultural significance of Celtic religious practices and their adaptation to changed political circumstances. The Druids, deprived of traditional roles as judges and political advisors, focused activities on religious instruction and Celtic cultural memory preservation. Their schools relocated to remote areas beyond direct Roman supervision, continued training priests and scholars, maintaining Celtic intellectual traditions while adapting to Roman rule realities. The economic transformation accompanying Romanization created new opportunities for wealth accumulation, while altering traditional production and exchange patterns. The Roman monetary system, based on standardized coinage and credit mechanisms, replaced Celtic economies relying on barter, gift exchange, and portable wealth accumulation in livestock and precious metals forms. The introduction of Roman commercial law and banking practices facilitated trade relationships connecting Gallic producers to Mediterranean markets, while providing access to manufactured goods and luxury items previously available only to tribal elites. Agricultural innovations that Roman landowners introduced to Gallic territories increased productivity while altering traditional farming practices and social relationships. The Roman villa system, based on slave labor and market-oriented production, replaced Celtic agricultural arrangements, emphasizing subsistence farming and communal land use. The introduction of new crops, improved livestock breeds, and advanced agricultural techniques increased overall Gallic agricultural productivity, while creating surplus production supporting larger urban populations and generating wealth for landowners. The development of manufacturing industries in Roman Gaul reflected both the availability of skilled Celtic craftsmen and demand for goods created by increased urbanization and commercial activity. Pottery workshops emerging in major urban centers produced vessels combining Roman forms with Celtic decorative traditions, creating distinctive Gallo-Roman ceramic styles, finding markets throughout the Western Empire. Metalwork industries that had produced weapons and ornaments for Celtic warriors adapted their skills to Roman market demands, creating tools, household items, and decorative objects reflecting the synthesis of Celtic craftsmanship with Roman aesthetic preferences. The road network connecting Gallic cities to each other and the broader Roman world represented one of the most significant infrastructure investments of the early imperial period. The construction of paved roads, according to Roman engineering standards, facilitated commercial transportation, while providing communication links necessary for effective administration. The road system also enabled rapid military force movement when necessary, ensuring Roman authority could be maintained even in remote areas where local populations might be tempted to resist imperial control. By the early 2nd century CE, the educational institutions emerging in major Gallic cities provided training necessary for Celtic youth to participate fully in Roman cultural and political life. These thoroughly Romanized Gauls, fluent in both Latin and their ancestral Celtic languages, possessed intimate knowledge of local conditions combined with Roman administrative expertise, making them invaluable to imperial governance. Their integration into Roman military and civilian hierarchies represented the culmination of the Romanization process, while simultaneously creating new opportunities for Gallic influence within the broader imperial system. The transformation was complete. The Gauls had ceased to exist as a distinct people. 2285. The military contributions of Gallic soldiers to Roman imperial expansion began with auxiliary units recruited during Caesar's conquest, but evolved into something far more significant during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE traditional Celtic warrior culture, with its emphasis on personal courage and loyalty to commanders, adapted remarkably well to Roman military discipline and tactical requirements. Gallic recruits brought physical advantages, complementing Roman training methods. Their typically larger stature, developed through generations of agricultural work and warrior traditions, made them formidable heavy infantry soldiers, while their cultural familiarity with horses and horsemanship created some of the empire's most effective cavalry units. The Gallic cavalry units, serving throughout the Roman Empire, gained particular renown for their effectiveness in frontier warfare and ability to adapt to diverse combat conditions. The Ala Gallorum, recruited primarily from the Treveri and Remi tribes, served with distinction in Britain, Germania, and Dacia, earning battle honours inscribed on their unit standards and commemorated in stone monuments erected in their garrison towns. These horsemen retained elements of their Celtic fighting traditions, including the use of long cavalry swords and distinctive shield designs, while adopting Roman tactical formations and command structures, maximizing their effectiveness in coordinated operations. The integration of Gallic soldiers into regular legions represented more profound transformation than their service in auxiliary units. By Trajan's reign, men of Gallic origin comprised approximately 30% of legionary centurions serving in Rhine and Danube frontier armies, reflecting both their military competence and complete integration into Roman military culture. These officers, many of whom had begun careers as common soldiers in auxiliary units, demonstrated the meritocratic aspects of Roman military service, while maintaining connections to their Gallic communities that facilitated recruitment and local relations. The economic prosperity characterizing Gaul during the High Empire period resulted from successful integration of Celtic agricultural knowledge with Roman commercial practices and infrastructure investment. The fertile soils of Gallic provinces, enhanced by Roman agricultural techniques and connected to Mediterranean markets, through improved transportation networks, produced agricultural surpluses, supporting both local urbanization and export to other empire regions. The grain production of the Seine and Loire valleys supplied Rhine armies and contributed to Rome's food security, while Gallic livestock provided meat, leather, and wool finding markets throughout western provinces. The manufacturing industries emerging in Gallic cities during the 2nd century CE represented successful combination of Celtic craftsmanship traditions with Roman market organization and capital investment. The pottery workshops of La Grafesenque in southern Gaul produced terra sigillata vessels exported throughout the Western Empire for their distinctive red-glazed surfaces bearing decorative motifs combining Roman artistic themes with Celtic design elements. The scale of production at these workshops, employing hundreds of skilled craftsmen and producing thousands of vessels annually, demonstrated industrial capabilities developed in Romanized Gallic communities. The trade networks connecting Gallic producers to markets throughout the Roman Empire reflected entrepreneurial skills of Gallic merchants who had adapted Celtic trading traditions to Roman commercial practices. Merchant families emerging in major Gallic cities maintained trading relationships extending from Britain to North Africa, facilitating exchange of goods including not only Gallic agricultural and manufactured products, but also exotic items from distant provinces. These commercial networks, supported by Roman legal frameworks and currency systems, created wealth funding, urban development, and cultural activities throughout Gaul. The emergence of notable Gallic figures in Roman political life reflected both Romanization policy success and recognition of Gallic talents by imperial administrators. Marcus Valerius Asiaticus, born in Vienne to a prominent Gallic family, achieved the consulship under Caligula and became one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Rome. His career, including successful military commands and extensive business interests, demonstrated opportunities available to ambitious Gauls who could navigate Roman political life complexities while maintaining connections to Gallic communities. The literary contributions of Gallic writers to Roman cultural life began with figures like Pomponius Mela, the geographer whose work provided detailed descriptions of Gallic territories and peoples, influencing Roman understanding of the region for centuries. His writings, based on personal knowledge of Gallic geography and customs, offered insights into Celtic culture, complementing the military and administrative perspectives dominating Roman literature about Gaul. The accuracy of his geographical descriptions and sophistication of his analytical approach demonstrated intellectual capabilities of educated Gauls who had mastered Roman literary traditions. The development of Gallo-Roman culture represented one of the most successful examples of cultural synthesis in the ancient world, creating traditions preserving essential elements of Celtic identity while fully embracing Roman civilization. Religious practices emerging from this synthesis combined Celtic deities and ritual traditions with Roman theological concepts and architectural forms, creating spiritual traditions satisfying both Celtic religious sensibilities and Roman administrative requirements. The temples housing these synthetic religious practices featured architectural elements reflecting both Roman construction techniques and Celtic spatial concepts, creating sacred spaces serving diverse religious communities. The educational achievements and cultural synthesis characterizing Gallo-Roman society during the High Empire began facing unprecedented challenges as the 3rd century CE progressed. The stability enabling Gallic communities to flourish under Roman rule gradually eroded under pressure of military crisis, economic disruption, and political fragmentation, fundamentally altering the relationship between Gaul and the broader Roman world. The crisis of the 3rd century struck Gallic provinces with particular severity due to their strategic position along the Rhine frontier and economic importance to the imperial system. Germanic pressure continued throughout the 4th century, demonstrating persistence of demographic and political forces that had created the 3rd century crisis. The Alemannic invasions of 356 and 357 CE, defeated by Julian in campaigns restoring his military reputation, showed fundamental strategic challenges facing Gaul remained unresolved despite administrative and military reforms of previous decades. Germanic tribes continued growing in strength and organization, while Roman resources became increasingly stretched by commitments on multiple frontiers. The gradual transformation of Roman Gaul into a series of Germanic kingdoms during the 5th century represented culmination of processes begun during the crisis of the 3rd century. The establishment of the Frankish kingdom under Clovis I in 481 CE marked the definitive end of any remaining vestiges of independent Gallic political identity. The Merovingian dynasty, emerging from this consolidation, created political structure that, while incorporating some administrative remnants of Roman governance, fundamentally altered social, legal, and cultural foundations, sustaining Gallo-Roman civilization for over 4 centuries. The Frankish conquest of remaining Roman territories in northern Gaul proceeded through combination of military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations, demonstrating Clovis's sophisticated understanding of both Germanic warrior culture and Roman administrative practices. The aftermath of Soissons revealed systematic nature of Frankish expansion and deliberate policies designed to eliminate any possibility of Roman resurgence in Gaul. Administrative records maintaining Roman legal and fiscal systems were either destroyed or appropriated by Frankish officials lacking training necessary to continue Roman governmental practices. The legal transformation accompanying Frankish expansion represented perhaps the most significant break with Roman traditions in Gaul. The Salic law codified under Clovis's direction around 510 CE established Germanic legal principles fundamentally contradicting Roman jurisprudence in their emphasis on collective responsibility, compensation payments, and legal status of different ethnic groups. The elaborate Roman legal procedures governing property disputes, commercial transactions, and criminal cases were replaced by Germanic customs relying on oath-taking, trial by ordeal, and judgment of local assemblies dominated by Frankish warriors. The economic disruption resulting from these political and legal changes undermined commercial networks sustaining Gallic prosperity throughout the Roman period. Mediterranean trade routes connecting Gallic producers to markets throughout the empire gradually ceased operations, as Frankish rulers proved unable to maintain security and legal frameworks necessary for long-distance commerce. The workshops producing pottery, metalwork, and textiles for export throughout the Western Empire either closed or reduced operations to serve purely local markets, eliminating thousands of skilled jobs and reducing overall wealth of Gallic communities. The role of Christianity in transforming Gallic society during this period proved to be both force for cultural continuity and mechanism for obliterating remaining pagan traditions. The conversion of Clovis to Catholic Christianity around 496 CE represented calculated political decision, enabling him to gain support of Gallo-Roman population, while distinguishing his kingdom from Arian Christian Visigothic and Burgundian realms. The baptism ceremony at Reims, conducted by Bishop Remigius, symbolically united Germanic and Roman populations under common religious identity, while establishing the Catholic Church as primary institution, capable of bridging cultural divisions. The systematic suppression of pagan practices characterizing Christianization of Gaul involved destruction of temples, sacred groves, and ritual sites, maintaining connections to pre-Christian religious traditions. Celtic sanctuaries surviving the Roman period through syncretistic adaptations were systematically demolished or converted to Christian purposes, eliminating physical spaces where traditional Celtic religious practices had been maintained. The Druids preserving Celtic intellectual traditions, despite centuries of Roman suppression, found themselves completely marginalized in the new Christian order, their knowledge dismissed as superstition and practices condemned as demonic. The linguistic changes during this period reflected broader cultural transformation, eliminating last vestiges of distinct Gallic identity. Celtic languages surviving the Roman period in rural areas and among lower social classes faced systematic suppression as Frankish administrators and Christian missionaries promoted use of Latin and increasingly Germanic languages in official and religious contexts. The Gaulish language maintaining vitality in certain regions despite centuries of Romanization gradually disappeared as speakers adopted Latin or Frankish to participate in new political and religious structures. Archaeological evidence for survival of Celtic elements in post-Roman Gaul reveals complex processes of cultural transformation characterizing this period. Metalwork traditions, producing distinctive Celtic artistic objects, continued influencing decorative arts of the Frankish period, with Germanic craftsmen incorporating Celtic motifs into their own artistic vocabulary. The pottery traditions maintaining regional characteristics throughout the Roman period gradually disappeared as Germanic settlers introduced their own ceramic styles and production techniques. The agricultural practices sustaining Gallic communities for centuries underwent significant changes as Germanic settlers introduced different farming methods and land use patterns. The Roman villa system organizing agricultural production around centralized estates worked by slave labor was replaced by Germanic settlement patterns, emphasizing smaller farmsteads operated by free peasants. The field systems developed during the Roman period were often abandoned or modified to accommodate Germanic agricultural practices, reflecting different environmental conditions and cultural preferences. The enduring influence of Gallic history on French national identity would not emerge until much later periods, but the processes of cultural transformation occurring during the 5th through 8th centuries established foundations for medieval European civilization that would eventually claim the Gallic legacy. The Frankish kingdom emerging from conquest of Roman Gaul preserved certain administrative and legal traditions, maintaining indirect connections to the Roman past while creating new political structures influencing European development for centuries. The development of feudalism in territories that had once comprised Roman Gaul reflected synthesis of Germanic, Roman, and Celtic social traditions occurring during the transition period. Personal relationships binding warriors to their lords incorporated elements of Celtic clientage systems, Roman military organization, and Germanic oath-taking traditions, creating new forms of social organization characterizing medieval European society. The agricultural arrangements supporting these feudal relationships combined Roman estate management practices with Germanic settlement patterns and Celtic farming techniques. The preservation of certain Roman legal concepts within Germanic legal systems created institutional continuities, eventually contributing to development of medieval European law. Frankish legal codes emerging during 6th and 7th centuries incorporated Roman principles of property ownership, contract law, and judicial procedure while maintaining Germanic customs related to criminal justice and social organization. These legal syntheses provided foundation for more sophisticated legal systems developing during the Carolingian period and beyond. The cultural legacy of the Gauls would eventually be rediscovered and romanticized during later periods of French history, but the actual Celtic civilization flourishing in pre-Roman Gaul was effectively extinct by 800 CE. The linguistic, religious, artistic, and social traditions defining Gallic identity had been systematically eliminated through combined effects of Romanization, Christianization, and Germanic conquest. The archaeological remains modern scholars study represent the only surviving evidence of a civilization that had once dominated much of Western Europe, but had been completely absorbed into the broader stream of European cultural development. The transformation of Gaul from collection of Celtic tribal territories into Christian Germanic kingdom represented one of the most complete cultural transformations in European history. The process beginning with Caesar's conquest and concluding with establishment of the Carolingian Empire involved systematic replacement of indigenous Celtic traditions with imported Roman and Germanic cultural elements. By 800 CE, the last vestiges of distinct Gallic identity had disappeared, absorbed into broader European cultural synthesis defining medieval civilization. The Gauls, who had once challenged Roman expansion and created sophisticated political and cultural institutions, existed only in historical memory and archaeological evidence. Their living culture had been transformed beyond recognition by centuries of foreign domination and cultural assimilation. The iron that had given them their first advantage, the oppida that had proclaimed their sophistication, the artistic traditions that had expressed their unique vision, all had vanished into the foundations of something new. The Celtic voices that had once echoed through those misty valleys had fallen silent, their languages forgotten, their gods renamed or abandoned. Their very identity dissolved into the emerging nations of medieval Europe. What remains is fragments, burial goods speaking of vanished glory, fortification walls outlining cities that no longer exist, linguistic traces embedded in place names and loanwords that survive the systematic erasure of Celtic speech. These remnants tell us that something remarkable once flourished in these territories, something that deserves recognition on its own terms, rather than merely as prologue to Roman conquest or foundation for French nationalism. The Gauls created urban centres rivaling Mediterranean cities, developed economic systems supporting specialised manufacturing and international trade, produced artistic works of stunning sophistication, and built political structures capable of governing large populations across vast territories. They achieved all this while maintaining cultural practices and religious traditions fundamentally different from the classical civilizations that would eventually overwhelm them. Their story reminds us that cultural extinction, however complete, cannot erase the fact that these people lived, created, struggled, and left their mark on the landscape and peoples of Europe in ways that persist even when the culture itself has vanished. Sleep now, knowing that beneath the familiar contours of modern Europe lie the buried foundations of a civilization that burned brightly for centuries before being systematically dismantled by powers that could neither fully understand nor ultimately preserve what made it unique. The Gauls are gone, but their absence shapes the space they once occupied, a silence that speaks volumes about the fragility of cultural identity and the relentless transformation that characterizes human history.